Hi everyone. Today we are going to have a conversation about Anton Hur's debut novel, Toward Eternity. The book is actually not on sale, but the writer's here. So I suggest you to buy the book online. And before I start, I want to make an acknowledgement that right now, as we are talking and sitting about literature, there is an invasion happening in Gaza and Lebanon. So, I mean, there is a kind of like a very different situation between us here and the people there. So I encourage everyone here to support and donate to Palestinians and Lebanese causes. And I have a postcard to share if you want to know some like my friends Maram's GoFundMe's campaign. Okay, so let's just get into the novel. Toward Eternity is Anton Hur's debut novel. Anton was a famed translator. He won the Pen Translate and he won the prestigious Penheim Translation Fund for Borachung's Cursed Bunny. And he was shortlist and also longlist, double longlist for Borachung's Cursed Bunny and Park Sang-young Love in the Big City. And then this year, we finally see Anton as a novelist. Toward Eternity is a novel that demands multiplicity in reading, as in you can read the novel in various ways and you will have different kind of like different conclusion about the novel. And I will use this multiplicity as kind of a compass to talk about the novel. Story-wise, Toward Eternity is a sci-fi novel. And it's kind of feel like the story of a new world emerging, kind of like the genesis of a new world. And then it's about how life transforms and how we navigate between the lives of like robots. In the novel, it calls nanites and human. I just want Anton to speak about how he found the idea to write this novel first.
Um, First of all, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you, Norman, my fellow International Booker Prize nominee. I think you're the second Indonesian novel writer ever to be.
The first Indonesian gay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very rare honor. I think even like Asian nominees for the International Booker Prize, there must be like fewer than 10. So he's one of them. So that's really, really amazing. Yeah, so I got to writing this novel in the shower one day. When you're in the shower, you're very bored. And boredom is very generative. There's this poet, I think she just retired from Princeton. Her name is Susan Stewart. And she wrote a book about creativity in poetry. And one of the things that she says is, technology makes boredom so obsolete in the modern world that we've lost the generative power of boredom. Was it Iris Murdoch who said that once we figured out how to cure tuberculosis, like we lost so many good works of literature because no one had to be sent to a sanatorium to do nothing anymore? And so the shower, like you can't take your phone in there. Now you can because iPhones are now waterproof. But so I had this idea in the shower because I was so bored. And in tribute to Susan Stewart, there's also a scene in the same book. It's called Notebooks. And Susan Stewart is like sitting on a beach, and there's like a child like building this elaborate sandcastle on the beach. And then the child all of a sudden starts like destroying the sandcastle with like complete and utter glee and happiness and joy. And she's like, well, why would he build that giant sandcastle and then do that to it? And then she realized, well, destroying it is part of creating it. And she was so fascinated by this idea, and I can feel her fascination for it. And there's a scene in my novel where these two children, they like build a really, really elaborate sandcastle, and then they have another child. They bring another child over to destroy it, and they're like, and all three of them are like really, really happy and joyful, like the way children are. And so there were a lot of ideas kind of like that came into this one thing. It's about creativity, creation, like creativity and replication, how you can't ever replicate anything As a translator, I'm always accused of like, am I replicating someone else's work? But it's in a completely different language, and it has like my reading of the book in the translation. So it's not the same work, really. And I try to make it the same work, but it really isn't. And also, I had this idea about like musicians being the same way. Like there's a cellist in here, and she doesn't compose her own work, but her rendition of Mozart or who's the other one, Bach, or whoever it is that wrote the Art of Fugue. I think that was Bach. Yes, the microphones are working. You do not have to test them anymore. So all of those ideas about like how replication kind of like creeps into cloning, DNA, creativity, reading poetry, creating music, it all became like the basic pattern of how I structured the book. That's why there's so much like reincarnation, repetition in the work.
So the novel is written in the epistolary form, as in written like a letter or diary. And then it's fascinating that the novel is the notebook somehow, and the notebook was kind of like passed on to the next person, and the next person became the next writer of the notebook, and then of the novel. So I just wonder about this decision to write the novel in epistolary form because it's challenging. Kind of like you have multiple writers, multiple like point of view, and then it requires a kind of like polyphony to work. So I just wonder, this is kind of like such a big challenge for a debut novelist.
Well, as a poet, I'm sure you understand better than most people do that like form is everything. And like once you have a form, a lot of people think that form is very restrictive and it restricts your creativity. But form is actually very generative. It actually stimulates creativity. So I named myself after A.S. Byatt, Antonia Susan Byatt. So Anton comes from Antonia. She's my favorite author. And A.S. Byatt told this really great story once. She judged a poetry writing competition at this, I believe it was like an elementary school. And because this is England, they have honors elementary students and non-honors elementary students. And the honors elementary students were given the freedom to write free verse, whatever they want. But the non-honors elementary students were told to write in rhyme, in form, like couplets or something that had like a strict form. And A.S. Byatt said it was really interesting how the poetry that came from the non-honors group was much better than the poetry that came out from the honors group. She was like, there was like form actually helped them, inspired them. And so for me, as a translator, I always pay very, very close attention to form and how an author wrote their book, because that informs how I'm going to translate it, obviously. And the epistolary, the diary, specifically this diary form that came up, like it was also inspired by A.S. Byatt to some extent, because in her best-selling novel, Possession, which won the 1989 or 1990 Monolingual Booker Prize, which is what I call it, when it won the monolingual, it kind of experimented with all these different epistolary forms. Like there were letters, there were diaries, and there's like a fake diary where like the wife of this writer is trying to throw off his critics by writing a fake diary, and I thought that was so interesting. So yeah, as I was writing it, I realized that, oh, this is actually going to be like, this is the form that's emerging like from the depths of my subconscious. And I had read enough A.S. Byatt to recognize where exactly I was. I wasn't quite plagiarizing it, but let's face it, I was getting a lot of ideas from A.S. Byatt. And so there's like a non-existent like building at the University of London that I put into the book, which is called the A.S. Byatt Hall.
I think we should hear one of the diaries of the novel, so you should read some passages for us.
So this is from the cellist. She's a clone. She's a concert cellist, and she was basically cloned from herself in order to cure herself of cancer. And she's like not sure if she is herself, quote unquote, now that she's a clone. But because she's a musician, she has a very distinct understanding of what it means to be a rendition of something as opposed to the thing itself. Okay. I am a cellist, and I have devoted my now very long life to music. I do not know what problems music solves for anyone else, if indeed it solves anything. But for me, it solves the problem of what to do with immortality, just as it had solved my problem of what to do with my mortality before my transition. Music is as eternal as the universe. It is part of its very fabric, and a musician is only picking at a small corner of the universe, a tiny dot in it, when they turn air and time into sound. A musician's task is not to create sound from nothingness. A true musician understands that music is the primordial state of the universe, the very first world, and silence is the cloak imposed upon this state. And a musician's job is to create a tear in that cloak to let out that music underneath. We do not create music. We draw it out from underneath the silence. I draw it out from my cello, my tear in the cloak. It has been 15 years since my transition. I have now been a concert musician longer than I was supposed to be alive. But even then, I have not played all the music that exists in a universe, a planet, or even a room.
So Alan, the name of the cellist, and then years later, the clone of Alan became soldiers, and then it turned kind of like very violent from cellist to soldiers. And let's talk a bit about the Alan character, because there is a scene where Alan finding her clone in the kitchen. It's kitchen, right?
Yeah.
And then there is also another part where, so there is another character called Panit. Panit is an AI that is transformed into human. So it's kind of like very strange novel, because we often see human becoming into computers. This is the other way around. And there is a moment where Panit was shocked that he was put into a male body that resembled, quote unquote, his parent, the one who invented him. So there is always a moment of kind of like seeing the self in the book. And then it's kind of like there is a line about no kid want to be their parents. I just want you to elaborate more about this.
Okay, so the idea of Ellen came from this really great book of English literary criticism called Mad Women in the Attic. And it's about Rochester's wife in Jane Eyre, and how women are portrayed in literature as insane or somehow problematic, but how in that way that women are problematically portrayed in literature, sometimes it's very subversive. And as we know from Wide Sargasso Sea, written by John Rice, that there's a way to kind of like work those I don't know what to say it, like those subversive elements like into its own story. And one of the really interesting things that Mad Woman in the Attic, the book points out, is that there are a lot of doubles in Victorian novels. Like there are two characters who are different, but they're similar. They're almost twins. And it's interesting how when these two twins meet, one of them has to die, or one of them has to be eliminated somehow. And I thought, like, this is such an interesting idea. Why don't I do this literally? And so there's like this clone, the character I just read to you, Ellen, and she kind of like her cloning. She's made of nanite cells, which are nanotechnological like cells, and the swarm that comprises her is very experimental, and so it creates all these different kinds of Ellens, and so she sees all of these doubles. And that's a very unsettling experience. Think of how unsettling it would be if you met your twin. I mean, maybe you are a twin, but if you're not a twin, like think of how unsettling that is. And I was like, it's really interesting that our first instinct is that, oh, this is very unsettling, or mine would be. Like, it would be very strange to meet another Anton Hur. And so, yeah, so that's where she came from. And then I kind of like ran away with the idea. And Panit is also, it was so strange that that character, and it's really interesting that you mention it. Yes, everyone else is a human being who is turned into a clone, but Panit is a AI that's turned into human, basically, although he's also turned into a clone. And with Pani, I basically had an AI character who was separate from all of these other characters, and he just emerged like fully formed in my mind, and I had no idea like what he was going to do in the book. And then one of the other characters was like, "Oh, we're going to make you into a clone," and I'm like, "Oh, so he's actually sort of like the antithesis of all the other characters in that way." And indeed, it's his child who becomes the clone army in the end of the book. So yes. So I could see everything, I saw everything very abstracted and structurally in terms of form. And this was not restrictive. This was very liberating because it liberated me to continue writing the book. I'd be like, oh, I know where this is supposed to go because I could see it structurally in my mind. A.S. Byatt used to talk about how she saw her novels in colors. And she would be like, like the vibe of this book, like it's like green here with a splash of gold here, and I used to be like, what are you talking about, lady? Like, but then now my mind works a little differently. Like I can see it in like terms of like strands and ropes stretching this way or branches stretching that way, and I can like detect the symmetry, and I'd be like, well, if this character exists, then the antithesis, the double of that character should exist over here. What would that look like? And then immediately I would have like the other half of the book. Like I had so many experiences like that I totally recommend just like be bored, think abstractedly. You may end up with a book of your own.
Panet is definitely a mesmerizing character. May I say my favorite character from the novel? And then the funny thing and exciting thing about Panet, he kind of, we can say, lived the course of like a whole life. He traveled. And then this is maybe world building wise. I just wonder if Panet would have a passport.
Oh, so he is given a passport, like
Yeah.
a forged passport by,
Yeah.
yeah, by.
So I just wondering about the world in the Toward Eternity novel. Like, how do you imagine human mobility in the novel?
I have a very, and Jeff Vandermeer, who wrote, Absolution and all of those, Annihilation and all of those other books, like, Jeff Vandermeer actually reviewed my book and he hated the world building. He was like, wow, he was like, okay, it has a very beautiful first half, but then like in the second half, it kind of like, why are you so pessimistic about where the world is going to be? Why can't you like present a solution? So he said something along those lines, and he has a very, very valid point, and we all love Jeff Vandermeer. And so that's kind of like the warning that I have of the book. It's a very capitalist like conclusion to like how things end because it's basically an arms company that destroys the world. And about mobility, so the thing about that is I once read this article written by this woman who used to work for Goldman Sachs. And she went on a business trip in a private jet that one of her clients chartered for her. But she forgot her passport at home. And like on the plane, she was like, oh my God, I forgot my passport. And then the other Goldman Sachs person on the plane was like, oh, they don't check for that. It's fine. And so when you're rich, flying on a private plane, and she was flying from like New York to Switzerland or something. And like they did not bother checking her passport when she landed. And that's the world that rich people live in. Passports are for poor people. And and Panit is, he's given access to money. So that's kind of like my little commentary on, yeah.
Uh, I heard the word pessimism just now from you, and the novel is kind of like very pessimistic, but in a exciting way somehow. So there is a when Panit was going to be turned into a human, he said, and I quote, "I do not think it is possible to say that I have been alive if I cannot experience death." And then after, so he got married and then got separated. Panit said, life is toxic. Like all toxins, in small doses, it cures. In large ones, it proves fatal. And I had had too much of life. I had wanted to know what it would be like to be human. I know it now. It made me want to die. I think this part really wrecked me. I mean, you can say you have been alive if you cannot experience death, but then later you say to be human is to want to die. I just, how do you arrive to this kind of like observation?
I think death is the great meaning generator in our lives. Like, because we know that death exists, we work that much harder to live. And obviously, there are people who choose death because the pain in their lives is just too much. And that's, I feel like that's a very, like, who am I to say anything about that choice? But I also feel like one of the ways in which you know that you really lived your life is that you welcome death at the end. And so for Panit, it's like, well, I've done everything. He found love, and at the very end, he finds that he actually had fathered a child that he didn't know, and that child needs him to die. It's explained in the book. And that child needs him to die, and so that's why he willingly gives his life to save his child. And so for me, it was not like a moment of pessimism where like, oh, like I hate life, I want to die. It's more like, well, I've actually done everything, and I think I can step out of it with grace now. So for me, it was coming from that. But of course, that's just like my mindset. It's really funny because like there's this Malaysian book blogger who I love. Her name is Afi, and she had received an ARC of Toward Eternity. And I kept telling people like, oh, it's a novel about cloning AI and poetry, and and it brings the end of, and it has the end of the world in it, but it has a happy ending. And she was like crying on her Instagram stories, and then after reading my book, and I was like, why are you crying? It has a happy ending. And she's like, Anton, how do you think that this is a happy ending? So you'll have to. So apparently, what I thought was a happy ending, because I thought I was talking about how love conquers everything, even death. But for her, it was like, no, this ending is really depressing. Like, how dare you call this a happy ending? So I think maybe my worldview is a little twisted, and that's what Jeff Vandermeer was also trying to tell me.
Okay, we have talked a bit about the novel's polyphony, like it's written from multiple perspective, but then each of these character they have different kind of like totally different worldview. One is Celeste, one is kind like a scientist, and then well, one is AI with a Victorian poetry obsession. So there are so many quotes from like Emily Dickinson and Christina Rossetti. So but all of these observation in each characters they are authentic. I just wonder how do you achieve this level of polyphony in terms of like being able to make a observation regarding Milton, and then the next you are talking about South Korea, global politics, and then the other you are going to talk about like science.
Oh gosh, I've never really thought of it that way. I always think of it as very lazily written. I mean, it has all of those, like, first of all, it has all of those elements that you just described because they were things that I just knew and didn't have to research. And therefore, I could just like write extemporaneously about. So I have a master's degree in Victorian poetry, and I can't believe it turned out to be useful. Um, that's why there's so much like Christina Rossetti and Wordsworth. Wordsworth isn't quite Victorian, but like Wordsworth and like all of the poets that I loved studying and writing about, and they are very polyphonous. Like Wordsworth and Christina Rossetti and Emily Dickinson as well. Like they all have this very like science fiction mindset when it comes to writing their poetry. Like you can read it as science fiction. You can read some of their poetry as science fiction, as speculative fiction. I thought that was really, really interesting, and I wanted to bring that out uh, in this because like in my novel. And for the arms thing is really funny because when I realized that, oh, there's going to be a clone war and I need an arms corporation. And at first I made it Chinese, and then I had a beta reader was like, oh, that's kind of racist. And I was like, okay, how do I make it not racist? The only way to make it not racist if the company was Korean. But I was like, a Korean arms company? Like, do we even have an arms industry? And then I looked it up and we have $1 billion arms industry. And I was like, okay, this is very embarrassing, but at least I can use it in the book now. And so the company, the arms company is actually a Korean company. And Korea actually, yeah, extremely problematically like exports arms now. So that's how that ended up in the book. Yeah, so it was a lot of these things were like done with either no research or minimal research. And I just like, and it ended up being polyphonous because I guess I was just like so too lazy to like keep a consistency of voice throughout the book. I don't know.
So, well, we talk about that you have observation about Milton, and there is a part where you make observation about how poetry was used to justify the colonizations of Southeast Asia or like Asia in general. But then when the so this is a war novel, it ended like being kind of like nuclear soldier, uh, like full of the war novel, and then at the end of the war, the soldiers start remembering poetry. Somehow I found it very like illuminating, like how before poetry was used to justify colonization, and then poetry emerged to stop the war somehow. I just want you to talk more about this.
Yeah, so it's very, very accepted within Victorianist critical circles that the Victorian canon was used as a propaganda tool of during especially the 19th century, but also the 18th century, colonization efforts by England, like across the world, in order to portray British interiority as like this very, very vaulted humanist, whatever, and everyone else as savages that need civilizing. And so I knew of this entire discourse, and I but I really, at the same time, I really, really love Christina Rossetti and all of the poets that I wrote my thesis on Christina Rossetti, and so because I had like this double reading of it, I guess the double reading of that kind of like came out into the book itself. The it was actually a lot less skeptical and critical of poetry until again I had another beta reader. Have beta readers and sensitivity readers, guys. Like they're very useful. And this beta reader was like, oh, you know what? Like I feel like you have like a very essentialist view of poetry, and this is going to be problematic, like in the long scheme of things. So I was like, okay, then I'm going to put in this disclaimer, disclaimer paragraph passage. And for some reason, everyone quotes from that passage. Like everyone loves that passage. And I was like, oh, I'm so glad that I put it in now because now no one thinks that I'm a white supremacist or something. But yeah, but it does play off of a very, very interesting idea. And also, so in the book, basically there are these clones, and these clones are given an AI that is trained on critical poetry. So this is really going to sound really stupid, but like, so I studied AI and machine learning, and one of the things in machine learning is that it's very difficult to train an AI to appreciate something. It's one thing to train an AI to write poetry or to pretend to write poetry, but it's very difficult to train an AI to appreciate poetry. And I thought, well, in the humanities, we use the Socratic method where you have a discussion amongst your peers and with a professor, and you talk about and dissect a poem. And I thought, well, that's what you have to do with an AI. And so in the book, there is a Victorianist scholar who has constant conversations with an AI in order to train it. This is not like a very, very original idea. Like Richard Powers in his book Galatia 2.0 basically has the same premise. And so because the AI is trained through poetry, like I think it's like 200 years down the line, what these cloned soldiers who have like appropriated that AI for their intelligence, they suddenly start remembering all these poems that they don't understand. And that's to convey like how persistent poetry is, because I went to graduate school at Seoul National University in Korea, and so I'd be sitting in Korea reading, Emily Dickinson, and I'd be like, wow, it's 2016 and I'm a Korean citizen sitting in Korea reading Emily Dickinson, who, I have never met, who no one I know has ever met. So like, why does poetry persist like this? Like, we think of poems as like the weakest thing in the world. Poems are corrupted all the time, but at the same time, they're really powerful and really persistent. And I thought this was a very interesting dichotomy that they had. How could something so weak be so strong and resilient at the same time? And that, like, all of those scenes with the poetry is sort of my feelings about that, my awe towards poetry in that regard.
One of my favorite part in this novel is when Panit woke up after being turned into human. And I just wonder if you want to read some passages.
Okay. Oh yeah, this is the passage that I read aloud the most, actually. Yeah. Okay, so this is the AI that was trained on poetry, and then he wakes up as in a human body. When I came to, I was in a bed. I could hear the sound of the waves. A white bed in a white room. There was a piece of pale blue, almost white sky outside a large window. Underneath, a pane of gray blue ocean. With difficulty, I sat up. I had never sat up before in my life, but I somehow knew how to do it. I was seeing with my eyes, a far richer experience than any camera had prepared me for. I realized for the first time that shapes, colors, shades, all of these bits of visual data that I had only regarded as information were actually imbued with emotions. Even the minimalist whites of the room and the pale blues outside were overwhelming in their beauty and purity. How could humans stand how madly beautiful the world was? I was briefly overcome. When the effect began to subside to manageable levels, I realized that I was also feeling textures. I felt the silky cotton sheets against my skin, the breath inside me, my heart beating in my chest. My breath, my heart, my beating pulse. I spent a long moment in stillness, simply feeling the air being drawn in and out of my lungs, feeling my beating heart, marveling at my own pulse. I slowly moved my eyes from the movement of the waves to the clouds and to the folds of shadows in the thick white comforter. When I finally felt confident enough, I slowly brought my right hand before my face. It was a pale hand. Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this my heart will rather the multitudinous scenes incarnadine. Shakespeare, the superstitious play not to be referred to by name. It was not a 19th century work, in other words, not my area of expertise, but the Bard had been quoted often enough back then to be considered essential texts, much like the King James Bible. The quote came to me not as readily as it had before, but when it did, it had a force and clarity that knocked the breath out of me, my now literal breath. I suddenly realized that I understood the words like I'd never understood them before. The multitudinous seas, incarnadine, words that were not simply bits of cross-referential information, but each a thing of living, breathing, tactile emotion. I felt these words against my skin as if they were physical objects, or as if they were light passing through the prism of my body and shattering into the spectrum. Had I ever truly understood any word before, ever? How could I have claimed to have made a study of poetry, or that this study had made me human, when I had never understood what it meant to feel words? Thank you.
That was my favorite passage, and you read so beautifully. Thank you. And you've heard about like the human AI said he never stood a sit before, but he just sort of knew. I think it was kind of like very beautiful observation, like to the kind of like life that we never felt. And then when we talk about lives that we never felt, I want to bring that. This is kind of like a war novel, and then this is also kind of like a modern version of Frankenstein in a way for me. And then there is a part in the beginning of the book where Post Young Hun, the AI person now, he disappeared, and then you know that Frankenstein when like he vanished too, the creature, but then we know that in the Frankenstein novel the creature whatever he chose it is always demonized, while at the same time, Yonghun was seen very differently. There is a part in the book where you say to speak to someone is to give them humanity somehow, and then you say it also humanity is given. I just want you to talk more about this.
Absolutely. So this is also a very classical idea in the humanities. Humanity is performative, not in the social media sense, but in the humanities scholarly sense of performative, in that it has to be performed in order to exist. Like, it doesn't essentially exist in you. And people are always like, you're only human if someone else sees you as human, or maybe perhaps yourself sees yourself as human. And that's why we have the kind of atrocities that we have going on today, where we don't see these, like this particular set of people as humans, so we colonize them, we massacre them. And so, and that's why like racism exists, because we see like someone of a different race as someone who is like not human somehow, like their humanity is somehow like degraded. So this is a very classical idea that I kind of like took to the extreme. So I was like, can we give humanity to AI? Can we give humanity to a clone? Can we give humanity to people who are unrecognizable at this point? And a lot of especially Korean science fiction stories deal with this very subject, and we are publishing a book next year from Simon & Schuster titled "If We Cannot Go at the Speed of Light" by Kim Choi-up, and I'm translating it. And in "If We Cannot Go at the Speed of Light," it's a short story collection, basically about like how humanity is given to different kinds of people, and how sometimes we fail to give humanity to another person, and what the consequences are for that. And this is an extremely, like, I feel like it's a very Korean preoccupation, because we've experienced colonization and extreme capitalist neo-colonization. And so for us in Korea, it's always sort of like, do I feel human right now? Am I human right now? Are we treating this person with humanity right now? Like, it's just sort of like a very Korean preoccupation that that I'm very, very excited to bring into English, if we cannot go at the speed of light. And it was also one of my preoccupations in writing Toward Eternity.
Okay, maybe now let's talk a bit about your practice, because this novel has a, so Alan, the cellist, is a white South African, and then there are passages talking about the apartheid in South Africa. So we know that Korea and Indonesia both were colonized by the Japanese, and then kind of like there are a lot of like colonial legacy from those occupations. I just wonder how you work as a translator and as a novelist in a post-colonial world, how the colonizations affect your practice.
Colonization, how does that affect my practice? So in the sense that I have to think a lot about like, what is humanity? What does it mean to be human? I think like more than my writing, it's been my translation where, so I am the third translator of color ever to be shortlisted for the International Booker Prize. Like there were only two others before me, and there were only like two others after me. Like, and you know, there are 5 that are shortlisted every year. And even if you look at the long list, there are like maybe like 3 more, maybe 2 more translators of color who were longlisted before me. So like people look at our work as translators and it's immediately discounted. Like I see it happen all the time during, especially in the beginning of my career, during contract negotiations, where because you're not white, your English is somehow less valid and your translation is somehow less valid. Like I went through so much of that in the beginning of my career. Now I'm like I have the approval of all of your white institutions. Like you cannot tell me shit. Like that's my negotiating attitude now. And yeah, so now it's less of an issue, but I remember like, because I'm a cisgender Korean man who lives in Korea, like I'm extremely privileged. Like even though I'm gay, I can kind of, like cis men can disappear into the closet and use male privilege in a way that, for example, lesbians cannot. And so because I have that privilege, and I've lived in Korea for 30 years, for most of my life, and then what happened was that when I entered literary publishing in the Anglosphere, all of a sudden, like all this racism started happening to me late, and so I don't behave like someone who was conditioned, who grew up with that, like because I didn't grow up with that, so I behave very entitledly, and like I see all these like white people in publishing who are like, oh my god, like why is he behaving this way? Why is he so rude to me? And I'm like, I'm not being rude to you. I deserve respect. So, and you're not giving it to me, so I'm not gonna give it to you back. Like, it's as simple as that. And so, it's really the business side of publishing and writing and translating where I kind of deal with that more. I don't know if I really deal with the decolonial, like in the story, because apparently I was so like delulu in the writing of this book that I had to have a sensitivity reader go, oh, you're being a little delulu. You should talk a little about decolonization in the story. Another beta reader, it sounds like I had a million beta readers, I had 3. So my third beta reader was like, there's a chapter that got cut in the book, but in it, one of the characters commits what's called global apoptosis, and so all of the clones disperse like at once, like around the globe. And her comment was, "Is this genocide?" And then I was like, "Oh yeah, it is a genocide against clones." But because they're clones, in my mind, like I had been prejudiced, even though they had been my characters. But I needed it for the plot, so I took that chapter out. But I took that word genocide and I used it somewhere else, and this was before the current events in Gaza. And now it's like, now I see it everywhere. I'm like, I did not set out to write a book that was necessarily decolonial, but it kind of like transpired that way I think it's really because of the events of the world that kind of made that reading possible.
Yeah, and then when we talk about the genocide, it revolves around the idea of efficiency somehow, and it's how do I say? I think it's the idea of like being better than the other. It translates to different kind of words, and in this novel, it's efficiency. Um, and how do I say? I'm not well. Most queer people are not efficient. I don't know how to say this, but I just want to relate it because this is such a queer novel. Like so many queer characters, even the straight one doesn't feel straight, if it makes sense. And then I mean, it's a robber. It's an AI dating a human. So, and then the human went pregnant. So it's kind of like very wild in its like how things transpire in the novel. So maybe I want to take a look a bit about to your book self. Is like talking about the queer influences you have in your life to create such a queer novel.
Oh, sure. So one of them was like a meme, and it was like, "Are you writing a novel?" And then it's like a flow chart, and it's like, "Does it have lesbian characters in it?" And if it's no, then you have to go to add more lesbians. And then if it's yes, then it goes to add more lesbians. And so I looked at that flow chart and go like, okay, I'm gonna add more lesbians. So there's this one couple that was heterosexual, and then they became a lesbian couple, like in the book. Roa's parents in the book. So she has two mothers now. But otherwise, so in literary studies, I'm not an academic, but I do have a bit of a background, and that's why I keep referring to it. But like in literary studies, when we say we queer something, it doesn't mean that we turn like straight characters gay. It means that we erase boundaries, basically.
And one of the most exciting part of the novel is the queer feelings, the lesbians.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
we love queer feelings, and so, but I wanted to erase every boundary that I can think of, like between human and clone, between male and female, between like, so that was where a lot of the queerness and queering, I think, comes from the book.
So the lesbians are the spy of Janus of the
Yes.
Korean company corporation. So I kind of like feel somehow it's feeling, but I feel liberated because I mean as a queer we often feel we should be good, we should be kind, we should be like
We should
Jesus
be spies.
shining, and then I want to be evil. So I kind of like I want to know more. Maybe this is my last question before we go to the audience. Like how do you feel liberated when seeing queer villains on the popular media, and how this affected uh, your artistry?
Queer villains. Like, God, this is gonna sound so morally relativistic, but I really like that lesbian couple. They're actually inspired by an actual lesbian couple that I know, and love, and like, and they do work for a corporation. I don't think they're spies. Yeah, I think, I think that's also part of the queering, really. Like, of course they're villains because they're spying on Yonghun and they work for this awful corporation that ends up destroying the world. Like, there's really no ambiguity about that. But there's also something about like but then they raise this daughter who they obviously care about so much, and then this daughter tries to bring down the system, and I'm giving away so many plot points, but you can still enjoy the book even if you have a few spoilers. But like, so I kind of wanted to. It's just it's just very boring and difficult to write. You know, a book where someone is very clearly just absolutely good and someone is absolutely bad, and it's really hard. And I've experienced so much where I'm like, sometimes you do have to like just extend grace to people, and of course it depends on like what they did and how badly they did it, of course, and all of that, and it has to be a discussion. But yeah, so it never really occurred to me to portray anyone in this story as a victim, or sorry, as a villain. There are many victims in the book, as a villain, and so I don't know. I think that comes from A.S. Byatt because I think A.S. Byatt kind of even her villains are kind of like really just at the end of the day they kind of try to make up for their wrongs and whatnot. And I think that's always like we have so much injustice in life. Let's see a little justice like in the book, and maybe that's what Jeff Vandermeer was also trying to tell me. But yeah, I'm realizing a lot of things today on the stage.
Okay, we only have time for Q&A, but before it starts, I want Anton to read the last passage.
Just here to here. Okay.
So this is like happened like long in the future.
Yes. Somehow I know we will not have much time, and it would turn out eventually that I'm right. Echoes, mother, I whisper as she helps me up. We're echoes inside an echo. I hug her fiercely, feeling her being taken aback and then accepting, finally consoling. But whatever do you mean, she says, as I finally bring her to arm's length to look her in the face. She looks so healthy, a young woman full of intelligence and life, and love, mother, that's the echo. But echoes are weak, and we don't have much time. The people who are us, the original Namfundu and Mali, their love for each other was so strong that the nanites, they made us come back. We're like phantom limbs, but centuries old, like ghosts. And this place, she glances about, gripping my hand, firm and sure. You said this is an echo too? I don't know. I think only the light and fog aren't nanites, possibly the dirt. I think everyone living here must have transitioned. We're on a generation ship or something, some sort of interstellar lark. It would make sense to transition then, to sleep while crossing the vast expanse of space. Mother, I missed you. I've missed you so much. I would have given anything to have this moment with you. My words and all my language collapse into sobs, into pure emotion as they lose form. I grip onto her and sense she is already slipping away. Already as my words start coming back, her reassuring grip feels lighter and lighter. Mali, I love you. Mother, I love you. I love... She is gone.
And that's Anton Hur. Okay, we are gonna open the Q&A session. Please ask good questions. Okay, anyone wants to have questions in their mind? Okay.
There's a mic coming. Yes.
I have read your book, and I'm not really a science fiction reader or a philosophy reader. And I wonder if all of the talks about science fiction, about philosophy, about poetry, are you a type of writer that will, okay, my book is not about this, but about this, or are you the type of writer that I will trust the reader and not gonna intervene the experience or the genres that the readers thinks of your book, as Norman talked about that. Some of the things that you talk about, most of people talk about if it's pessimism, but you are not thinking that way about love too. That you think it's a tragedy. A lot of people talk it's about tragedy, but you're not thinking about that way. Will you intervene about the reader's experience in the future or not?
Thank
As
you.
a translator, I am completely against writers and translators intervening in the reader's experience. I think your experience is your experience. So I'm mostly known for translating Bora Chung, the author of Curse Bunny. And Curse Bunny is available in the tent, not my book, but Curse Bunny is. So Bora she has a PhD in literary theory. And so she said to me very early on in our collaboration, Anton, like, your translation is your work. You just do whatever you want with it. I think she would have been fine if I just created a character and like inserted it into the translation. She's like, you do whatever you want with it. There's nothing you can convince me that your translation is my work. Like, so you are free to do whatever you want. And like I have had, and she's like, I have received too much education in literary theory and I've taught too many classes on literary theory to believe otherwise. So you cannot convince me otherwise. And so I was like, okay, that's great. And that's kind of like my attitude as well. I mean, I think it's very amusing that people think that the very happy ending that I took very great care to create is depressing and sad. But then like if I think about it, I'm like, oh, they're not incorrect. Like, I guess you can read that as a sad ending, but you know, don't you want to believe that love conquers all? That's just how I feel. I think like the first part of your question had to do with science fiction, and like I'm not like Margaret Atwood, who's like my work is not science fiction. Like we love Margaret Atwood, we love everybody. But I'm very proud to be a sci-fi writer and all of that. It's just that on the marketing side, these are all just stupid marketing terms. Like we have to market it as literary fiction because science fiction writers will go to the literary fiction shelf, but literary fiction readers will not go to the science fiction shelf. So, and this is something that Jeff Vandermeer pointed out because he is also marketed as literary fiction, but he writes extremely science fiction. Yeah. And my agent is British because I think British authors are really good at this, at writing extremely literary science fiction. And it was like, I used David Mitchell a lot as a comp in my head when I was writing, when I was trying to sell Toward Eternity to his agent turned me down. That's okay. I got a better agent. And yeah, so for me, I feel like we're living in an era where science fiction and speculative fiction is like more respected anyway. Like Cursed Bunny is a work of feminist horror and science fiction, and it was shortlisted for the International Booker Prize. So from the beginning of my career, I always knew this was a genre that I wanted to work in and continue working in. My second novel will be science fiction. My fourth one will be historical. My fourth one is about, I'm calling it Gay Wordsworth. And it's basically like, what if Coleridge and Wordsworth were gay? Because we're all thinking that, come on. And so I'm gonna write a book about Gay Wordsworth and have like gay readings of his poems like in the book. It'll be fun, yeah.
Okay, more questions. Anyone wants to ask something? Oh, okay.
Hi, Anton.
Hi, Elian. Hi.
Hi. Okay. So, talking about reading experience, I think I've told you before. How do you feel if, say, readers like me, extremely heterosexual, and then we didn't get all the queer, I don't know, like references. We don't get the all. I guess the lesbian part is very very bold, but then other queer aspects of the book is very subtle that I didn't catch. How do you feel about that? Thank you.
Oh, so Elian owns Transit Bookstore in Jakarta. And this is such a funny story because like an early panel that I did, there were like 3 panelists and there were only 2 people in the audience. And like they were like kind of despairing and I was like, oh no, if it's the right 2 people, like, you know, I'll do a panel. And so we did the whole panel. One of them was her. And she launched our book in Indonesia and also like online. And like before we became Booker Prize nominees. Like she did our event as well. So like, you know, Transit Bookstore at Jakarta, they have taste, man. Yes. So Elian, you can read whatever you want or not read whatever you want from my book. I don't care. I trust you. But that goes for everyone. I mean, there are so many like little allusions and little like things, but that's just scaffolding that I put up so that it's easier for me to write the book. Like the reader just has to experience what they experience. And I actually went through a lot of rewrites with my editor and with my agent as well. Like this book is very like almost a collaborative effort. I had a fantastic editor at HarperCollins. And Tara Parsons was like, she had me take out like a central chapter and then write a whole new chapter to become like the keystone chapter. And it works much better that way. And like, I thank her in the book and, you know, it's my favorite chapter now. So, and one of her comments early on was that, okay, there's a lot of like clones running around like shooting each other. That's really cool. But I really like the emotional like parts of this. So can you like maybe make it less actiony and more emotional? And I was like, okay, I think I can do that. And so that's how like this character became the child of this character. Structurally, it managed to connect the two halves of the book together. And so I was like, oh, it solves so many problems. And as a translator, I love it when problems just like solve themselves. Like that's when you know that you have an aesthetically pleasing, because it has to be pleasing like structurally in order to be pleasing emotionally. I feel, and that's just how I feel. And so I'm totally fine with like readers not getting every single like illusion. Like I think readers skip all the time. Like some readers will read a book like from the middle to the end and then go back to the beginning and read up to the middle because they're very impatient and they just want to be in the middle of the action. And that's a perfectly valid way to read a book and a perfectly valid way to read my book as well. So yeah, so I have no expectations as to that. As long as you enjoy yourselves and you learn something and are open to like rereading the book, yeah, that's all I can ask for really as a writer.
And if you want to order the book, you can order to Transit Bookstore, I
Yes,
guess.
transit. Yes.
Okay, any more questions? Okay. The lady at the front.
Hi, Anton. I'm here.
Hi.
Hi. I wonder if you can speak more broadly about Korean literature. You know, the world has gone mad for K-pop and K-drama, and clearly Korean literature is having a moment with the Nobel Prize for Han Kang. I just wondered if you could speak a little more broadly about what you're observing there and if you feel this moment is long overdue or if there's more that we need to be discovering about Korean literature.
Sure. I don't know if the Literary Translation Institute of Korea is here in this room right now. I hope they are to hear this. But the Korean literary establishment, until Han Kang won the International Booker Prize, was very, very conservative. And they would push extremely conservative works. And none of these books made any dent in discourse or bestseller lists or anything. And it was really, well, I guess like Please Look After Mom became a bestseller in like 2014, a New York Times bestseller, and that's about it. And then Han Kang and Deborah Smith won for The Vegetarian. And that's when it was like a signal flare that went up in the world of Korean literature and translation. And me and all the translators who debuted after that, we were like, oh, we can translate women, we can translate queer literature, we can translate very experimental, edgy Korean work. We don't have to kowtow to the Korean literary establishment. We can figure out how to get our funding, and LTI Korea just has to suck it. And so it was really, I feel that it was really the translators who deserve some credit here, because it was Deborah Smith who made her revolutionary translation of the book and who inspired us to be more daring in our artistic choices, not just in what we translate, but in also how we translate. And so someone was like, oh, is this like, is Han Kang winning the Nobel Prize, is this like the beginning of something? And I'm like, no, this is the peak of something that we have been building up to for the past, since 2016. And like, I don't like, you know, it's peak Korean wave is what we're jokingly calling it. Like, oh, it's all gonna be all downhill from here. So like, sell your samples now because it's never gonna be this good ever again. And that's kind of the translators' attitude now. I published 7 books this year, this calendar year. Blood of the Old Kings by Sung Il Kim, Your Utopia by Bora Chung, I Want to Die But I Still Want to Eat Tteokbokki by Baek Se-hee, Magical Girl Retires by Park Seol-yeon, Toward Eternity by Anton Hur, I Decided to Live as Me by Kim Soo-yeon, I believe, and what's the other Bora Chung? Grocery List, yeah. So 7 books this year. So I'm like, am I gonna have another year where I publish 7 books? I don't think so. I mean, next year I think I have about 5 or 6 books to publish. So I'm like, now is the peak. That's what we're saying right now. It's not gonna get any better than Han Kang winning the Nobel Prize. And I'm so happy that it was Han Kang and not Ko Eun or Hwang Seok-young or like any of these like cishet old Korean men who write about like how they were student activists in the 80s and like, oh no, and, like now they're all fucking reactionary, right wing, whatever the fucks. Like, I'm so happy that it was Hong Kong. I'm so happy for Hong Kong. Feminism, yay!
More questions?
As I listen to you, I think what a marvelous autobiography you could create. And I wonder if I hope you will start thinking about it. And I'd like to know a little more about your life.
Oh, thank you. That's very sweet. I did write a collection of essays that was published in a book in Korean. And people keep asking me, am I going to translate it? And I'm like, no, I want the honor of someone translating me. I'm not going to translate myself. I'm not, Jhumpa Lahiri. I'm not Nabokov. Like, I don't want to do that. So I'm waiting for someone to pick that book up and pick up that book. Sorry for splitting my verb tense. So I was born in Sweden. My father worked for Kotra, Korea Trade and Investment Promotion Agency, and so we moved around a lot. But I mostly grew up in Korea. But I did spend like a couple of years in a bunch of different countries, including Ethiopia, British Hong Kong, and I went to high school in Bangkok. So I spent the last 2 years of my high school in Bangkok. And then I spent my entire adulthood in Korea. And I met my husband in Korea. He's Thai American, so not Korean. And we got married in LA, and we've been married for 8 years. So I've kind of like had this like a life where it's like very tedious to explain. So maybe I should write an autobiography about it because everyone's like, oh, why do you speak English? At first they think like, oh, are you Korean American? And I'm like, no, I just sound vaguely American. I'm not Korean American or British or whatever. I'm an English speaking Korean. That's what I am. Yeah, and so maybe that should be the title of the autobiography, an English speaking Korean. But yeah, so that's basically my life in a nutshell. Yeah.
Okay, last question. Oh. The Mbak.
Hi, so you read so many wonderful passages.
Can you speak louder?
Oh, sorry. There's so many wonderful passages in the book, right? And like so many quotes in the book. So I was wondering, to what extent is your educational background and translation work helped you find relations of humanity? Like, how does your translation influence your book?
Oh, extremely. It's been extremely influential, and everyone should stay in school. Do not drop out. I was lost for a very long time. I majored in law and psychology. I did not study literature. And then in grad school, I went when I felt I was ancient when I went. But now looking back, I was very young. I was 33 years old when I went to get my master's in English literature. And I went to a very controversially conservative school, very canonical school. But for me, it was very helpful because I did not have a literary background. So to go to a conservative school where they were very like canon focused, that really helped me a lot. So I think you kind of like have to like find the education that you need. Some people don't need it. Some people need to network more really. So they need to just go to New York somehow and spend some time there or something. But some people like an MFA workshop, like that's very helpful for them. That helps them to not have to reinvent the wheel so much. And yeah, so but for me, I really needed to be able to read literature at a deeper level than I was reading. And having that kind of canonical, very conservative, very F.R. Leavis kind of like approach to literature, it really helped me. So you do have to identify what would help you, because a lot of people in my program, because to this day they still complain about it. They're like, oh my God, they were like so mean to us, blah blah blah. Like, so you do have to be very careful. But I always recommend education. I think it's very very important.
Okay, thank you, Anton.
Thank you,
I think
everyone.
we are reaching the end of the conversation. I want to note that Anton's appearance at the festival is supported by LTI Korea. I have to do it.
It's fine. I pay taxes.
And
It's my money, really.
And then Anton's, you can follow Anton's in his Instagram at Anton Hur.
And my book is not available in the bookstore, but I have bookmarks. So if anyone wants a bookmark, please come to the stage.
Yes. Thank you, everyone,
Thank you so
for
much. And
coming.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Norman.